solar art space. Alrighty, so we are gonna get started. If you are here, this is Group Hug's weekly solar talk. This week we're talking to Alex Nathanson of Solar Power for Artists. I'm gonna give a really quick intro and then I'm gonna hand it off to Alex to talk about his work. Hello and welcome. If you have come to every weekly talk, this is a little repetitive, but my name is Crystal. I'm the founder and CEO of Group Hug Solar. At Group Hug, we make ridiculously good-looking solar panels that are easy to use because renewable energy shouldn't be that complicated. Our main product is a window solar charger. You might have seen us on Shark Tank or Kickstarter. We currently sell this on our website. I'll give you guys some more information of where you can learn more. If you want to learn more about us, you can go to grouphugsolar.com. We started these weekly talks because people ask us advice about solar. I think solar, unfortunately, is a very technical field that can be a little intimidating to learn about. So we try to make that information really easy to understand. We added a new nifty tab to our website where it'll list all of the upcoming events. So definitely check that out. I want to give a brief shout out to Emma. Emma, can you wave and say hi?
Hi guys, nice to meet you.
So Emma recently just joined the Group Hug team to specifically help us with community events and weekly events. So thanks, round of applause for Emma for helping put this on. And she has been working to put together a weekly talk from now until the end of the year. So thank you to Emma. If you want to learn more solar information, we're pretty active on Instagram. We post things like different ways to go solar. We'll post about our product. We'll post about climate change policy. So if you're interested in that, you can follow us here. A quick plug that for next week's event, we're going to be talking about community solar with Steph Spears of Solstice, a community solar company. If you don't know what community solar is, it's basically a way that you can go solar if you don't own a house and don't have access to your rooftop. If you live in an apartment, you can go solar today and actually save money. The reason why I wanted to invite Steph is because Solstice does a really good job at breaking down how easy and affordable it is. So I'll send you guys a link to RSVP to that next week. It's going to be really great. And then one quick tease. Emma has been working on putting together a solar gingerbread contest. So we haven't officially announced it yet, but if that is something people are interested in, please drop it into the chat. We're thinking about putting together a contest where people can build their own gingerbread houses and be creative about how you add solar panels to it, whether that's with candy, gingerbread, chocolate, whatever you do. And whoever comes up with the coolest design will get a free window solar charger. So let us know if you like that idea in the chat. You'll be hearing more about us from that. But we have one person who said, yay, solar gingerbread contest. So, and it'll be like a community voting, so different people can vote on it. All right, so that's enough of me. Now I'm gonna turn it over to Alex. Alex and I actually first met, I think, was it at Kickstarter, Alex?
Yeah.
At Kickstarter. So I had just started with my solar panel Kickstarter project. I had learned about Alex's work and how he was using solar in such creative ways from like a designer's perspective, and it's super inspiring. I'm gonna let him talk more about it. So I'm actually going to stop sharing and let Alex take over. Go for it, Alex.
Cool.
Great.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for having me. So this talk is, I'm going to sort of just give an overview of my practice as an artist and a designer sort of generally, and then sort of transition into talking about my research into this space and the field sort of more broadly. So Solar Power for Artists is a platform that I use for basically organizing a lot of educational and sort of creative work in the space of photovoltaics and also sustainable energy sort of more broadly. So the goal of solar power for artists is to make solar power knowledge accessible so that practitioners without engineering expertise can apply this technology in their local contexts. And it encompasses educational resources, an archive of creative applications of solar. We do events and workshops in normal times, and then a lot of sliding scale consulting, engineering, and design services for all sorts of folks. And the real sort of mission of solar power for artists is to think about in what ways is the climate crisis a sort of an aesthetic crisis. We know how to solve the climate crisis. We've had the technologies for, over a decade. The challenges we face are really political and cultural, and how do we sort of, create space to address those particular aspects, and also inspire people to imagine what a future could look like that is, one where we're actually stepping up to the challenge of the climate crisis. So my work in this space started in 2014. I was co-curating an exhibition of electronic artwork in a community garden in Queens. And we had been told by the garden members that we actually had access to power from the neighbor and could run an extension cord. But it turned out that that wasn't the case, and we had to engineer a new solution, and solar power turned out to be the way to address it. So we installed a small off-grid system in this garden to run this exhibition of interactive and light-based electronic artworks. And sort of from that point on, my sort of creative practice slowly, and my education teaching practice slowly became mostly related to sustainable energy over the last 6 years or so. So this is a series of work I did in 2017, creating functional mosaics. So all of my work and all the work I'm interested in this space is functional solar powered work. It's not speculative necessarily. It all produces energy. Here's some other work that I was doing around that time. These were sort of small motion studies around kinetic sculptures using solar cells with, very cheap materials, very low sort of resolution, balsa wood or like simple laser cut shapes and stuff like that, very simple circuits. And here's some examples of some more photovoltaic instruments that are also have a lot of kinetic elements in them. So on the left is a series of prepared violins. When you shine light on the solar cells, there are electromechanical elements in the violins that move and vibrate, and that sound resonates within the violin and then is amplified and can be further manipulated. And then on the right, a photo of me performing with some photovoltaic inputs for a synthesizer in collaboration with the composer Dylan Neely. So very similar to the violins, where the level of light being shined on the solar cells changes the sort of aesthetic sound properties that are being produced. And then it can also be manipulated through some knobs and switches and things like that I built in. So most recently, my sort of artistic practice with photovoltaics has been focused on thinking about its relationship with sort of the internet and ideas around what the cloud is and the energy footprint of the internet. And so this is a project that I'm currently developing called Solar Protocol. It's a collaboration with Tiga Brain and Benedetta Piantella. And it's a network of solar-powered web servers. And they're all serving content based on the amount of sunlight at that particular location around the world. So right now, if you go to solarprotocol.net, you can see It's very much in development, so sometimes it's offline, sometimes it's working as we sort of expand this network. But the content is served based on where there's sunlight. And so during the day in New York City will be, that server location will be probably the lead server on the network. When it's midnight in New York, you might see content from, you might see content from a server in Asia, and it'll just move around the world depending on the time of day, but also the weather has a big impact on the system. And we're really trying to explore ways of sort of connecting the abstractness of the internet to the energy that internet processes consume as it becomes an increasingly central part of our lives. So in addition to that work, which is all sort of part of my art practice, I also have a design practice, which sort of exists in parallel in a lot of ways. So here is a series of interactive solar installations that I created for the Climate Museum. And it's a zoetrope, chimes, and some beambot style little robots. And when visitors shine flashlights on the solar cells, the zoetrope starts spinning and it produces an animation. The chime starts spinning and creates sound, and then the bots sort of start jumping around. Here's another project also created for the Climate Museum, which is a hand crank energy efficiency station. So my work does sort of extend beyond solar power into other areas of sustainable energy or climate change communication and interaction design. And then currently what I'm developing is a series of educational solar structures for the NYC Department of Ed's Office of Sustainability. So these are 3 structures, a rolling cart, a table, and a small trellis system that have integrated small off-grid systems that will be used as teaching aids. So there'll be class material that, this will augment existing class material, but also curriculums will be developed around these systems. And it's sort of part of a growing program in the NYC public school system around connecting classes to sort of sustainable energy and changes to the built environment in relation to the climate crisis in New York. And these will be, this is ongoing, but I think we'll start installing these in the spring. So solar power for artists as a platform, as I mentioned, it encompasses a lot of stuff. The platform, really originally was in 2018. I started it as a way to sort of highlight a lot of the research I was doing at the time. And that's largely been focused in on archiving and sort of trying to define this domain of creative applications of photovoltaic solar power. So the website has a fairly detailed archive of a lot of the work that I've sort of grouped together and sort of brought together in conversation with one another. And then that work has since led into a book that I'm working on that will likely be out in either late 2021 or possibly early 2022 at the latest. And that is a history of solar power art and design. And it's predominantly a history of functional creative applications of photovoltaics. So it includes a whole range of mediums. So there's sculpture, installation, product design, sound art, textiles, etc. So a whole bunch of stuff in there. And I won't really go into a lot of depth there, but just maybe a few sort of notable trends that I'll mention are that artists and designers have explored are ideas around chance operations. So if you have the aesthetic output of an artwork be dependent on sunlight, there's obviously a lot of variability there based on the weather and time of day and things like that. There's a lot of artists exploring ideas around natural systems and natural logics, power starving techniques, which is something that you see in a lot of sound art, where maybe you have a synthesizer circuit that behaves very predictably when it has a very defined power supply, but when you connect it to solar power, once clouds or birds or squirrels or what have you, disrupt the or cover the solar cell, that voltage fluctuates and creates really interesting aesthetic outputs. There's obviously a lot of connections between sunlight and time, and so there's also a lot of artists exploring that relationship and timekeeping systems in relation to light. There's a lot of ideas around autonomy, so maybe that's autonomous robots, or maybe that's just the ability to site a public art installation in some remote location. And then a lot of sort of people thinking about how can you use public space to be a space of education around climate change technologies. And often that happens through public art. So a few of my sort of perennial or current favorites work from the book is Clock Tower Project by Christina Kubish, is a sound art piece in a clock tower, a defunct clock tower at Mass MoCA. There's a work by Ulrich Gabriel, which is called Terrain Number 2, and that is a series of solar-powered robots that are controlled by the participants' brainwaves. They wear like a interface, and the robots behave in sort of interesting ways based on the light, which modulates based on their brainwaves. So there's a lot of work sort of at this intersection of like, or sort of interested in sort of the idea of what a cyborg is and sentience and things like that you also find within solar-powered art. This work by Alan Giddy, Home, which is pictured on the right. This is actually probably one of my all-time favorite photovoltaic artworks. So it's 6 sort of discrete LED light panels that are each solar powered independently. And at night, they create, you can see this, this image here on the top left of this image, they create the sort of suggestion of a very specific house in Ireland. Giddy is based in Australia, and the piece is trying to think about ideas of identity and home and immigration. I really love it because it just speaks to this like love of minimalism that I have. That's just it's a really simple piece that works really on a lot of different levels, and makes perfect sense to be using solar power. It's very self-contained in that way. Yucca Tech by Amor Munoz is a series of workshops with indigenous women in Yucca that is really trying to both sort of simultaneously create economic opportunity, but also really interrogate what ideas around expertise and technology are. Studio South Zero by Turquoise Dyson is a really interesting project around thinking about ideas around Black identity, environmental racism, and the ways that her sort of abstract art practice interacts with that. And Low Tech Magazine is a really important project, ongoing project within the space of solar powered media and thinking through how do you design a website that conveys to the user the power that's being consumed by using that website and things like that. So I think that's the talk. Thanks for having me. And yeah, very happy to answer any and all questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex. That was really interesting. I really love that LED house silhouette. I think it's so simple and beautiful and poetic. Yeah, I think that would actually be really interesting in New York, like a solar silhouette of like a skyscraper of
Mm.
just
Yeah, yeah.
windows. We did have a couple questions, so I'm just gonna go through the chat and pull some of them out. One that actually strikes a nerve with me is from Reginald, because I have struggled with this myself. Reginald asks, um, can you describe the basics of how you cut into a solar cell? So, like, can you cut into them anyway without
Mhm.
having to worry, or can they still work if they are broken?
Um, yeah, so the short answer to that is you can do it by hand, you can do it with an expensive laser cutter, um, and both of those processes are going to produce very different results and very different levels of difficulty. Um, I actually tend to use a lot of uh, what are called like these solar cell grab bags. So you can buy these like offcuts from the factory. So they're actually being upcycled and they come broken and they're relatively cheap. And so you can buy a few bags. I think they're like $10 for like 40 random pieces. And then you can mostly get away in my work. I don't really often need to cut them because I just get a bunch and then I sort of treat it more like a puzzle. But you can break them by hand. That's going to be very, uh, not very refined, but it will work. You can also cut them with a glass cutter. So that's maybe one of the better ways to do it by hand. Solar cells are really fragile, so it is like going to be difficult to get a good cut, but it just with practice, you can get a good cut. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, you can use a laser cutter. Um, and not all laser cutters, but it has to be like the proper laser cutter for the material. But then you can, get incredibly exact cuts. As far as if it still works or not, um, basically the power of a solar cell is a factor of its surface area. So the smaller it is, the less energy, the less power it'll produce. Um, but if you're aware of the sort of electrical characteristics of the material, you can design for that in certain ways. So that's the
Yeah.
main thing.
And actually, for people who are less familiar with solar cells, like here's a polycrystalline solar cell. I also have like a bucket of these, so like you guys can see how thin it is. And literally, I'm not a strong person, and I just broke it like that. So it is really difficult to, I think, to get refined cuts. Actually, at Group Hug, Alex, I think I was telling you about this. We were looking into buying a fiber laser cutter to actually be able to cut shapes and make different mosaics. I haven't done it yet. Because I don't know how I can fit that in my apartment because I don't have I don't have like a workspace anymore. But there are ways to do it.
Yeah.
Really, really good question. We had another question from David who asked, how long do you think it took from solar power technology being developed to like creative and artistic applications coming up?
Yeah, so it's funny. I actually like right at the last minute, I took out that slide from my deck. Yeah, so the modern solar cell was developed at Bell Labs in 1954. The first sort of creative applications, like the very first, started as soon as about 1956, 1957. There are some uh, creative things that are happening. It's sort of, partly I think it happened. We need to define what we mean by creative to an extent, because a lot of design or industrial design is maybe in a sort of a gray area where someone wouldn't necessarily think of it as a creative application. Because there are a lot of, like radios and things like that were, definitely designed that came out at that time. But yeah, there's an Ames of chair fame piece called The Solar Do Nothing Machine that was created actually as an advertisement for an aluminum company in 1957, 1958.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
yeah, and then there's in the late 60s, there's two Max Newhouse and I'm blanking on the name of the other person, but there are two sound artists that started making solar work then. And then in the 70s, Alvin Lucier and Joe Jones started making sound artwork then. But then it's really in the 80s that it starts accumulating and there actually starts to be a space for this. But you know, it's really only like, honestly, it's like part of why I started creating this archive and the book is because a lot of this work is really not really understood as photovoltaic artwork. There's very few artists who are understood as working in this medium. There are some very famous artists who have worked with solar power, but you know, their work isn't necessarily identifiable by that. And there are very few exhibitions that would be about photovoltaic work or anything like that. So in general, the history is very sort of disparate, and I'm trying to bring it all together in a coherent narrative in my work.
Yeah, I honestly wish that if your book had existed when I was doing my research, like, I feel like I think that might have had a really big impact, because I think there's so much technical history documented, like having done some of the research too, and it's all from the lens of like the utility, right? And I think what you're doing is so important, because as everybody knows, like, not everything is actually so utilitarian. Like, you need the artistic touch, and you need empathy and human and a diversity of form factors, and you need all of that stuff, and it's really hard, super hard to find. So I can't wait for your book to come out.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. We've got another question. It's actually a little longer, Alex, if you want to read it too in the chat. It's a question kind of about scale of your work.
Yeah.
Like micro versus macro. Like, do you see any of your exhibitions or works like scaling into a bigger actual power generating installation?
Totally. So yeah, again, like all of my work and all the work I'm interested in does produce energy. It is, functional. I think partly it has to do with what within my own practice, it really is about what the goal is. So for example, with the Solar Protocol project, we're specifically exploring what it is to what would it mean to have a website that is powered by solar power with a small battery so it doesn't run all night, right? Like my personal website doesn't need to run 24 hours a day. And, maybe there's some opportunities for interesting design there. With sort of larger scale things, so, there's building integrated photovoltaics, which is sort of the space where that's sort of the large scale space for aesthetic interventions in solar energy. And that is a very difficult space to work in for a lot of artists. Once you get into the building scale, there are a lot of issues around, building code and safety. And so to address those, you really have to have a well-funded project. I think that's the biggest thing. So there's a few glass artists that work at the architectural scale. There's a woman named Sarah Hall, who's Canadian, who I think probably does some of the biggest and most complex work, sort of what we would maybe traditionally have thought of as stained glass with integrated photovoltaics. But a lot of her time is spent sort of, making sure that her modules are like UL listed and stuff like that. I mean, most artists don't have the budget or the time or the expertise for that to happen. Some do, but yeah. And then it looks like in the question, yeah, I think you mentioned Land Art Generator. So yeah, I mean, I'm very familiar with their work. A lot of their work is really interesting, and actually, my favorite thing that they've done is actually a pamphlet on sustainable energy technologies geared towards creatives, which is a really wonderful resource. A lot of their work is really speculative. I'm not aware of much of their large scale work, if any, that's actually been built. And that really, I think, just speaks to a lot of those issues around code issues and just the expense of this stuff. Because when you get to a certain scale, the costs of labor and engineering expertise are pretty prohibitive. But I mean, again, so in a lot of my work, for me, it's really about education and thinking about how to make these technologies that feel very futuristic or opaque more accessible. And so how do we lower the bar for someone to actually be interested in this space? Or what does it look like for a frontline community to actually be able to gain the knowledge of sustainable energy technologies, to have agency in the discussions that happen at a sort of infrastructure governmental level that affect them every day. And so for me, I think that's when it comes to what it means by scaling. For me, it's about that's sort of how we scale impact. I'm not really super concerned in this space so much about scaling in terms of kilowatts, right? But also I think we're entering a new phase of sustainable energy technologies where we may the price has gotten so low that we are going to start seeing more and more small scale products that have integrated photovoltaics. And then we need designers who understand the technology, but also understand ergonomics and issues around physical mobility or something like that. Maybe you're talking about a solar powered backpack, and we need to be able to increase that sort of baseline education for people who aren't trained engineers. And the impact of that is really unknown because we don't know what this field will look like in 5 years. But if we are thinking about a world where there are more solar integrated products, those products need to be accessible and usable by the untrained public.
Yeah, 100%. I know we usually try to wrap around 6:45, but we do have more questions. So I'm gonna keep firing questions at you. I actually have one that I don't think we've ever talked about this. What did you study in college? How did you get into solar?
Well, I mean, my undergrad degree is in photography and political theory. So not this. But and then through before I was sort of really focused on sustainable energy, my income was mostly through mostly through multimedia engineering for museums and artists and other sort of community-based organizations, and then also a lot of education work as a teaching artist. But then through my work as a multimedia engineer, doing a lot of interactive installations and video and sound art stuff for museums, that's a very technical field. And, one of the things that makes it a sort of nice type of work, for me at least, is that it's very open-ended. So you can just learn as a job, where you're you take on a project or a client, or you work for a museum and the artist comes in, they want to do something that's never been done before because there's no reason for it to ever been done before, because this artist had some idea, right? And so then you have to research and figure out how to make it work and make sure that it can run for 3 or 4 months while 50,000 members of the public stream through the building. So through that, my work and life just became a lot more engineering focused. And then I ended up getting a master's degree in integrated digital media, but my research was really focused on sort of education and aesthetics around photovoltaics.
Cool. That's amazing. Wow. And I think I know that a bunch of design students are potentially here too. Emma is currently studying industrial design at Drexel. And I think for anyone watching who is interested in solar, but seems a little intimidating, or the technical side kind of freaks you out, I don't have an engineering background. Alex doesn't have an engineering background. So you can do it. And there's people in the field who are working on this, who I think, I totally agree with Alex. We actively need more designers to be working with photovoltaics. And I think the solutions will be much better if there's more of us in the field.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, everyone, in the same way that it's useful to just have a good understanding of like any system that impacts your life, I think, everyone should be, hopefully, we can move towards a future where everyone's aware of sustainable energy and the systems the infrastructure that supports it.
Yeah, totally. So maybe we've got one more question from David. He asked, do any solar companies have artists in residency? So for example, Kohler might have a ceramic artist in residence in their factory. I didn't know that. That's cool. Yeah, do you know of anything like that?
I don't. Yeah, if you hear of anything, let me know.
They should.
Yeah.
They should have
I
that.
mean, yeah, this is sort of, I think it gets to like this industry as sort of both in the sort of art space, but also in the device integrated photovoltaic space. The economics of it are sort of very different from the broader PV industry. And so, the economic case for like any artwork is sort of, sometimes relies on like a good economy, because then companies have money they want to spend, or museums have larger budgets or what have you. So yeah, I don't know of anything, but there's no reason they shouldn't. I mean, they're certainly making a lot of money right now.
Yeah, I think I think again, like you think of energy and solar as so utilitarian, like they're literally like blocks of rectangles that go like in the most efficient way. And I think people just, the work that you're doing, I think pushing people to see it in a different way is so important. If anyone has any last minute questions, drop them in the chat. Alex, how can people help you? Like, how can they support you or keep in touch?
Yeah, so if you go to the Solar Power for Artists website, I have a mailing list there. I'm also on Instagram as Solar Power for Artists. But yeah, I mean, I'm always, as I said, a lot of the work I do, I sort of treat it as a sliding scale. So I have clients that are much larger clients, like, the Department of Ed or something. And, those I have a sort of more standard, fee, right? But I also work with lots of community gardens and individual artists. And a lot of that work just happens, in a very casual way. And so, yeah, if people have projects that they're interested in, talking to me about, yeah, you can email me through Solar Power for Artists. My personal website is alexnathanson.com. So my email is just alex@alexnathanson.com.
Cool. Thank you so much. And actually, I want to read this one comment from Lisa, because I think it's really good. Lisa just said she really loves your work. She's at an EPC, which is basically a solar installation company. And she said it can be really boring sometimes, but solar is sexy, which I agree. And they sometimes install solar irrigation in community gardens. So yeah, maybe Alex can make you guys like a custom solar array for your garden too. That would be cool. Alex, thank you so much for joining. I think your work is so inspirational, and I think we will be sending everyone a follow-up email too, so we'll make sure people who want to keep in touch can. For everyone that joined, thank you for coming to the weekly Group Hug Solar Talk. Next week, we're focusing on community solar, so please come back. It'll be really interesting, especially for those who don't own a home, maybe are in college, live in an apartment, and still want to have an impact. So thank you guys so much for coming. Have a great Thursday. If you're like me, I'm going to take a break and then tune into the debate and try to stay sane. So thank you so much. And thank you, Emma, for organizing this.
Yeah, thanks,
thank
everyone.
you. It was fun.
Bye, everyone.